Hi, girls. Today we are going to be talking about the first half of the things they carried. So go ahead and grab your books and follow along with me. We are going to start with the first story, which is called The Things They Carried, which is where the collection gets its name. In this story, we meet Lieutenant Jimmy Cross, and he has kind of an interesting name, Jimmy Cross. There's a lot of symbolism there. First of all, his last name is Cross, and this is a story about the things that these soldiers carry. And so it's sort of a hint that he is carrying a burden, sort of like Christ carried a cross. Lieutenant Jimmy Cross is carrying the burden of his soldiers' lives with him, and he is in some ways a Christ figure to these men. He feels the need to sacrifice himself and his own desires, to sacrifice his love for Martha for the good of his men, sort of like a Christ figure would do. His name also is Jimmy Cross, JC, Jesus Christ. So there's that connection as well. Tim O'Brien is really trying to hit you over the head with the fact that Jimmy Cross is a Christ figure in many ways. We learned that all of these men carry various things with them. And some of the things are kind of interesting. One soldier carries a slingshot, right? A slingshot would be completely useless in the Vietnam War. And yet that slingshot provides him a level of comfort. It's described as a weapon of last resort. And so we see that a lot of the men carry things that are items of comfort that ease the mental burden, even though they will really do nothing to ease the physical burden of war. Another character, Rat Kiley, carries M&Ms. Rat Kiley is the medic, and it says that he carries M&Ms for especially bad wounds. We're never really told what that means, but one sort of theory is that he carried the M&Ms to act as placebo pills. So when he knew a soldier was dying and there was nothing he could do, he might give them an M&M, act like it's a pill, and say, "Here, swallow this. This will help you." And although that will do nothing for the physical pain, it could serve as a placebo and ease some of the mental burden that this soldier would be going through as he's dying. So that's one theory. It's never really explained to us, but that's a possibility. There's other objects that are mentioned in this story as well. At one point, there's a thumb mentioned on page 13. So if you flip to page 13, Henry Dobbins is asking about this thumb. And he's asking, what is the significance of this thumb that one of the soldiers is carrying around? And halfway through page 13, it says Henry Dobbins thought about it. And he said, "Yeah, well," he finally said, "I don't see no moral." He basically doesn't understand why this soldier is carrying around this thumb. And then the other soldier says, "There it is, man." And the thumb then really is supposed to signify that there's no point to war. Has this pointlessness to it. There is sometimes no moral to war. This soldier is carrying around a dead man's thumb, and it just is what it is. There's not really a lesson to be learned here. There sometimes just is no significance to the random horrors of war, and that dead man's thumb sort of signifies that. Some other kind of interesting things about this particular story. At one point we read that Jimmy Cross wants to tie Martha up, yet only touch her knee. And that is such a weird part of the story. It makes us kind of uncomfortable that he would want to tie this woman up and then only touch her knee in such a gentle gesture, like on a first date. And that juxtaposition of something so violent, tying up a woman, and then something so seemingly innocent, touching her knee, it is supposed to, I think, in some ways make us uncomfortable that these soldiers, they have this sort of violence to them that they're forced to do. And yet they are on some level young boys who just want to go on a date with a girl and touch her knee. And that juxtaposition of violence and innocence will happen continually throughout the book. And I think it's Tim O'Brien's way of showing that, yes, there is this violent horror to war, but at the same time, these are young 16, 17, well, not 16, 17, but 18, 19-year-old boys. And they have this innocence to them that is so corrupted by war. And that should make us uncomfortable. And that conflict should cause us to pause and think. Ultimately, this story is all about the burdens that soldiers carry, both the physical weight of what they have to carry and also the mental, emotional burdens of what they have to carry. And if you take a look at page 20, I think Tim O'Brien sums that up really well. He says halfway through the page, "They carried all the emotional baggage of men who might die." And then a couple lines later, or the next line, it says, "Grief, terror, love, longing, these were the intangibles. But the intangibles had their own mass and specific gravity. They had tangible weight." And so I think that is one of the main ideas of this collection is that, yes, there's this physical component to war, but there is also this unseen mental and emotional component to war as well. All right. Then we're going to skip to the next story, which is Love. This is where years later, our narrator, who is the fictional Tim O'Brien, he goes to visit Jimmy Cross, and they talk a little bit about Martha and other various things. And we learn that Jimmy Cross and Martha never really ended up together. And at the end, Jimmy Cross says something interesting. On page 29, he says, and do me a favor, don't mention anything about, and then he cuts off. And Tim O'Brien says, oh, don't worry, I won't. And we're not totally sure what Jimmy Cross is talking about, but based on what we learned in the first story, it's possible that Jimmy Cross is talking about the death of one of his men, maybe Ted Lavender or Kurt Lemon. And he feels a great deal of shame about letting his men die, and he doesn't want Tim O'Brien to write about that or talk about that. Another kind of interesting character we learn a bit about in Love is Martha. At one point, we learned that Martha may also have been scarred by the war as well. A lot of the people back home, saw a different side of war that equally, maybe not equally, but did scar them as well. Halfway through page 28, Martha is speaking to Jimmy Cross, and she says, "The things men do." And so that's kind of an interesting line. People have interpreted that as perhaps Martha is alluding to being assaulted in some way. We're not sure, but either way, she too in this passage seems to have this guardedness to her, and seems to be in some way damaged by the war and what she saw some of these men come back with after they went to war. So that's kind of an interesting story. The next story we're going to look at is Spin. Spin is a story that's sort of a lot of little vignettes. It's a lot of little kind of mini moments and scenes all within one story, and it's sort of all over the place. It's a little bit jarring to read. The things they carried, that first story, had that same effect as well. It jumped around a lot, and it was disorienting, perhaps in the same way that war is very disorienting. So that's an interesting narrative technique. One of the most interesting parts of Spin is when we learn that Azar killed this puppy, and this is on page 35. So if you flip to page 35, Azar blows up Ted Lavender's puppy. And then Azar says, "What's everybody so upset about?" And he says, "I'm just a boy." And that line, "I'm just a boy," is so powerful because Azar does something so violent, kills a puppy. And then he reminds us he is just a boy. These are young boys, young soldiers. They are, 18, 19, 20, 21. They're quite young, and they still have this innocence to them and this like playful boyishness, kind of like Azar blowing up the puppy, which isn't really that playful, but it is kind of this thing that a young rambunctious boy would do. Another thing I want to point out about this is that we will see a lot of violence done to animals, and this is one example of that. And for some reason, the violence done to animals, like this puppy being blown up, really affects us on like a very deep level. At a different point in the collection, someone shoots a water buffalo, and these moments are very jarring. For some reason, we as people connect to animals in a different way because they are so innocent, they are so pure. And so Tim O'Brien will show a lot of violence against animals, sort of to show us that destruction of innocence that comes with war. And for whatever reason, sometimes the death of an animal hits us more emotionally than the death of a human when we are reading about war. And I think Tim O'Brien uses that violence against animals to really get us to feel the pain and the horror and the violence of war in a way that I think we are desensitized to when we hear about the death of people in war, because we've heard that many times. But showing the death of animals in some ways kind of jars us awake a little bit because they are so innocent and pure. All right. And lastly, on page 36, at the end of this story, Tim O'Brien talks about what stories are for. And storytelling is a big motif in this collection. And the final few lines say, "That's what stories are for. Stories are for joining the past to the future." The final line says, "Stories are for eternity, when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story." And so stories are for remembering, taking the pain of war, the things you would rather forget, the things you are going to forget, and cementing them and keeping them alive in some ways. All right, next story, On the Rainy River. This is a big one. This story is so powerful, and it talks about Tim O'Brien thinking about running away to Canada when he receives the draft notice. We learn that he runs into this man named Elroy Birdall. If you're thinking about Joseph Campbell's Journey of the Hero, Elroy Birdall is kind of his metaphorical guide. And Tim spends a few days at Tip Top Lodge. What an interesting name, Tip Top, There's that alliteration, and it sort of suggests that this is a tipping point of sorts where Tim is trying to make a decision. Do I flee to Canada? Do I go to war? Um, and Tim contemplates this, and he ends up on the river, the Rainy River, the border between Canada and the United States. And he's on that river, and he has this experience of feeling like the whole world is looking at him. He feels this immense pressure, and that's the moment he decides he is going to go to war. And that moment is so powerful. In some ways, you could think of that as his crossing of the threshold moment. He's literally sitting on the threshold between Canada and the United States, and he's really contemplating what he should do. And so that is such a powerful moment when he crosses the threshold and decides to go to war. This whole story just, I think, is chock full of a lot of symbolism, journey of the hero moments, a lot of imagery that's really great to look at. And I think another thing that is really powerful is when Tim O'Brien does decide to go to war. On page 57, he says this, about halfway through the page: I would go to the war. I would kill and maybe die because I was embarrassed not to. And right there, he explains that a lot of times soldiers are not brave. They're just afraid of being seen as cowardly. And so that's why he's going to war. And that's sort of a paradox in some ways, but it is a really powerful message. All right. We are going to move on to Enemies and Friends. These are two stories about Dave Jensen and Lee Strunk. And I always remember Strunk stole Jensen's knife. That alliteration of Strunk stole reminds me of what this whole fight was about. So we have these two soldiers. Strunk steals Jensen's knife. It causes this fight. At first they're enemies, later they're friends. They make this kind of death pact to each other. And I think these two stories just on a whole show how friendship and honor are warped by war, and how sometimes the paranoia can cause men to turn against each other. Sometimes the fear can cause men to bond together in really powerful ways. And these two stories, I think, illustrate that quite nicely. All right, next story we're going to look at is How to Tell a True War Story. And this story really gets at the idea of truth and storytelling, which are two big motifs that Tim O'Brien explores. He talks about kind of the difference between literal truth and then story truth. And sometimes we are so obsessed with the literal truth. Is this true? Is this not true? That we miss the story truth, the emotional truth, which Tim O'Brien believes is far more important. And that's why he gets so frustrated with that woman at the end of the story. And he calls her kind of a derogatory term because she's so focused on the literal facts of the story that she fails to recognize the message behind this and the emotional truth and the way that the storyteller is pouring himself out and splaying out the facts of war and the emotions of war. And so that is kind of an interesting message. Tim O'Brien kind of implies that if he has to manipulate the literal truth to better convey the emotional truth, then that's what he's going to do, because the emotional truth is so much more important. I will note in this story and in a few other places throughout the collection, there are a lot of toys mentioned, like a yo-yo. And it's a reminder again that these soldiers are boys. They're so young and they have this innocence to them that is so marred by war. And they're still playing with toys like yo-yo and checkers. And so that is kind of an inclusion of that innocence that's so starkly juxtaposed with the violence of war. All right, next story, The Dentist. The Dentist is about Kurt Lemon and his trip to the dentist, where he is very cowardly, very afraid. And so to make up from that, he has the dentist pull a perfectly good tooth out of his head. And this story really reveals that these men will do anything not to seem cowardly because they're so scared of the world seeing the fear that they really do hold in their hearts, that they will do whatever it takes, even pull a perfectly good tooth, to conceal that fear that they feel deep inside. All right, that's a short one. Let's move on to the next one. The next one's a long story, Sweetheart of the Song Tra Bong. This story features a woman, which is so atypical for a war story. And this is a frame narrative. It's a story within a story where not Mark Fosse, Rat Kiley is telling a story about this man named Mark Fosse who brought his girlfriend over to Vietnam, and her name's Marianne Bell. Now, there is just no way this is true. Like, this is the most far-fetched story ever. It's absolutely not true. But the message behind the story is true. And that's kind of, I think, the point that Tim O'Brien makes quite often is, yeah, this story about this girl coming to Vietnam and becoming a greenie is completely outrageous. But the deeper message, which is that war can change people, war can steal people's innocence and transform them, that message is so deeply true. And so this story does a really great job of doing that. Marianne Bell shows up in a white sweater and pink culottes, a pink sweater and white culottes, which are like white flowy pants. And that clothing motif is so powerful there in displaying for us her innocence, her purity, her very naive nature. And then by the end of the story, she's been so transformed and mesmerized by war that she's now wearing a necklace of tongues, a symbolism of that brutality, that violence, that corruption that war can impart on people. And we know that. We've heard that message before, that men are changed by war, soldiers are changed by war. But I think that message, it becomes something we hear so often that we're desensitized to it. And so by putting a woman in the story and showing her transformation, that message of look at how someone can be transformed and corrupted by war, it hits so much more powerfully when you have a woman in the story rather than a man, because it's kind of a shock to us to read about a woman experiencing this. And so I think in some ways that's what Tim O'Brien is doing with these stories. He's manipulating pieces of them to make the story have the impact he wants it to have. Some other kind of interesting things about this story, this story, because it is a frame narrative, you have Rat Kiley telling the story and he's being constantly interrupted. Like, you're not telling the story right. Why are you doing this? You're going off on a tangent. And in some ways, there's some irony to that because Tim O'Brien sort of does that with his storytelling. So this story comments on the act of storytelling in some interesting ways. All right, next story we're going to look at, Stockings. Stockings features Henry Dobbins, and Stockings is all about the role that superstition plays in war. He wears this woman's stockings around his neck because they give him this feeling of comfort. Now, do the stockings really do anything? No, absolutely not. But sometimes the soldiers use these physical items, like stockings, to ease the anxiety, the mental and emotional burden that they feel. And so that's the point of the stockings. Do they really do anything? No. But do they do something to help the soldiers mentally? Yes. And sometimes that is the most important thing. All right, final story is Church. Church shows the platoon camping out in this Buddhist temple. And I think that right off the bat makes us feel a little weird. Like, soldiers don't really belong in a church. That feels like a violation of the sacredness of religion. And I think in some ways, Tim O'Brien uses this story as almost a microcosm to comment on the Vietnam War at large. We feel weird about the soldiers being in this church. It feels like a violation, like they shouldn't be there. And maybe that leads to this larger question of, should America be in Vietnam? That was something that I think Tim O'Brien really asked himself, because he was not really in favor of this war. And I think this story shows the way that war can intrude on life and on sacred places in a very disconcerting way. In this story, we see Kiowa and Dobbins, and they're sort of foils to one another. Dobbins represents like typical American ambition. He kind of puts on the facade of being faithful, and he has this sort of bravado about him in some ways. Kiowa seems to maybe have some more true, genuine faith in certain regards. And so they kind of juxtapose one another in some interesting ways. And one final thing I want to mention about this story, we see these monks washing their hands, doing this hand washing gesture. You could consider that a biblical allusion to the story of Pontius Pilate, because what did Pontius Pilate do when Jesus was condemned to death? He washed his hands to symbolically say, hey, this is not my doing. I am washing my hands of this. And in some ways, the monks are doing that. I'm washing my hands of this. You all being in this church, this is not our doing. But I think that leads to some larger questions of, can anyone really wash the guilt off of themselves in the context of war? I don't know. And this question, I think, this story asks some larger questions about what morality and what faith and religion look like during war, and if anything is really ever sacred in war. And those are some hard questions to answer. And so Tim O'Brien is certainly exploring that. All right, those were a lot of the big things I wanted to cover today. That's the first half of the things they carried. I hope you are enjoying it. There's so much more we could talk about, but that at least is a quick overview. All right, that's it. Goodbye.